Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of Expanding Your Faith. I'm Bishop Greer, and joining me tonight, as usual, is Reverend Mark
Greetings, everyone.
and Father Matt.
Hello.
And so tonight we're going to talk about clergy, what makes up clergy, what good clergy are, and of course, some of the things that we see that shouldn't be going on from clergy.
What's clergy?
What's clergy? And, well, I get that a lot too, so we'll even explain what clergy is for those that don't know. So we'll start there, I guess.
Sorry, I didn't mean to throw you off.
No, I was searching my mind for what I was going to start with here, so we'll start there, defining it. So, clergy are ministers, preachers, pastors, people who who help us on our spiritual path towards the divine. And there are clergy in all kinds of different faith traditions, not just Christianity.
Rabbis, imams,
Rabbis, imams, they all qualify as clergy.
Buddhist monks.
Some Buddhist monks, pagan priestesses and priests.
Bajoran Kais.
Bajoran Kais for those
Star
Trek fans.
Sorry, I just had to.
And so,
Oh, I can't forget the Jedi Grandmasters.
the Jedi Grandmasters, yes. And so, and even Pastafarians, some Pastafarians are clergy. It's basically anybody that leads us towards a higher power, towards a divine being, towards heaven, towards nirvana, towards whatever you want to call it, are clergy. And there are hundreds, if not thousands, of clergy in every state in the United States and every country around the world. And for the most part, some of them, I think, try to do their best to be good people and lead people towards God, towards the divine. And then there are some who are all about ego and glorifying themselves and making money and, that kind of thing. So, that is what we're going to talk about here. Little green man, big ears that speaks in third person. Yes, Yoda. Yes,
Master Yoda.
Master Yoda. So,
Grandmaster.
Grandmaster Yoda. Yes. So, and of course, as you might be able to hear and tell, storm has just passed us here in the great city of Augusta. So we have some lightning and thunder still in the background as we try this three clergy and
Three clergy in nature.
three clergy in nature. Yeah, so there you go.
It should be expanding your faith with three clergy in nature.
In nature. Yeah.
Because as much as we hear the rumbles sometimes,
That's right. Or the rain.
the rain,
Lawnmowers.
the
The
crickets.
lawnmowers, yes. Okay, so we kind of got talking about this last night. This was why the topic kind of came up was, we see a lot of clergy out there nowadays peddling things, trying to, like Jim Baker, we were just talking about a few minutes ago, peddling all kinds of different things, COVID cures and buckets of ration food that he could barely stomach when he tried tasting it, and things of that nature, trying to make themselves money. Joel Osteen comes to mind, making millions, but then refusing to let hurricane victims into his church to help them. Things of that nature. And for most of us sitting here around this table tonight, we remember back in the 90s there was a big congressional investigation into many of the popular televangelists. And the revelations that came out of that were absolutely appalling. Some of the clergy owned solid gold toilet seats that cost millions of dollars. Now, I don't know about you, but my butt's not that precious. So I don't need $1 million toilet seat. And then, of course, we have ministers like Reverend Mark Burns here in South Carolina, who spends 95% of his time on the air talking about politics and supporting various political candidates.
Don't forget about Dwight Longnecker.
And Dwight Longnecker. For those that watch us on TikTok and YouNow, we did a documentary a few weeks ago from a television show on Vice called Hate Your Neighbor, and it highlighted Reuben Israel and Mark Burns. And Mark Burns spent the entire time he was supposed to be meeting with the host on and off of podcasts and TV spots on television, pushing various political ideologies and political candidates. And that was all he did all day. Literally all day. That's all he did. And but he is considered clergy, even though that's all he does is peddle that political ideologies all day long. So that's one of the things that we got to talking about. We talked about how it'd be good to kind of talk about them and talk about what clergy should be doing and how they should be acting and living their lives versus what they are actually doing.
And clergy for me is coming out of my background is really kind of a super fancy word. I just really default to ministers or refer to the various offices that people may hold. And as Bishop was saying just a moment ago, there are people that are out there that use and abuse their position and have profited greatly from those positions and consider, and they are quote unquote ministers. And then you have the other group who are striving desperately to portray the life of Christ. Since we're speaking, obviously there's a lot of different religions out there that are doing their best to point people towards grace and kindness and love. In the Christian church, you have a group that they're doing everything they can to grow their church, love on their people, and because often you have the mega church pastors, and not all mega church pastors are this way, or various pastors that fall into some type of scandal, financial scandal, sexual manipulation, and so on, so forth. The ones that are reaching desperately to love and to bring grace usually get that less respect. They don't get the honor of people that hold them in higher regard or seek counsel. The office, the positions and the offices in the church were established to direct and point people to Jesus and point people to the life of Christ, to point people to the way that the kingdom operated, loving others, loving God, feeding the homeless, being hospitable, embracing the stranger, opening our hearts to those who were wounded, bringing healing where we could, and so on and so forth.
Right.
You know, I myself function, if you want to get technical and kind of in the weeds, you know, I myself function in the office of a pastor. And, you know, the easiest way to identify as a pastor is, you know, as a shepherd, someone
Right.
who's there amongst the sheep, with the sheep, and who smell like the sheep. They're
Right.
for a long time, especially in my first pastorate, there was this mindset and this teaching and this training amongst the circles that I was in that, you know, ministers should be, you know, so disconnected and so off and
Right.
so away from their congregation, and there was more of this celebrity mentality. And to a degree, that is true, because shepherds are not always in the middle of the flock.
Right.
You know, sometimes shepherds are standing off from the flock, looking at and surveying the surrounding land that the flock is in, taking notice of, you know, possible places where danger could come in amongst
Right.
the flock, rescuing the sheep, and so on and so forth. So there's an element of truth there, but like a lot of elements of truth, it can become perverted, because, you know, it's easy to step back and you only are functioning in the office from an administrative standpoint, and then showing up and preaching and stuff, so on and so forth, and then delegating out and letting everybody else handle your business,
Sure.
which you do have to do some of those things. But what happens is a lot of that translated over into such a disconnect. And I've found that as a pastor, you have such a heart for your folks that you want to be involved, that even though you know, I've had people sit in my office, and, you know, I rarely ever get anybody coming to my office to say, you know, I just love this church. I'm just thankful for the grace and the mercy. You know, anytime I have a meeting with somebody, it's usually a problem.
Right.
It's usually an issue, which I think is beholden to society, because our focus is totally on the negative. Everything's negative.
Yeah.
But even when, you know, you get the litany of everybody's laundry list, and your heart still breaks for them, because you want to see them flourish and function in peace and grow in joy and so forth. And, you know, the heart of a minister really is to step back and to see people fulfill their assignments, fulfill their purposes, understand the callings on their life, all while focused on that message and that love walk that was portrayed before us by Christ.
Right.
What God reinforced throughout the Old Covenant and Jesus spoke of and gave us in person. And, you know, that's really, in my view, the function is to, as best I can, to point people to Jesus, because while we should honor the gifts that are given to us, both in the ministerial circle, there's also gifts amongst us in the congregation,
Right.
among people. We should honor those things. While we should honor those things, we should also know that people are people. Until we reach eternity, we will not be that perfect being. We will have imperfections. We won't say everything correctly. We won't make every decision correctly. And because there's been so much perpetrated on congregations in the last 50 plus years of ministers beating up their congregations,
Right.
most ministers have a very short window and a very, you know, you only have so many strikes that you can have leveled against you. And it's a hard job. It's sometimes you do a lot of things no one's going to see.
That's right.
You know, you meet with people and you avoid problems by diffusing situations that no one in the church will ever know about.
You're kind of like a firefighter.
Sometimes you feel like that, and there's been times where I've helped diffuse issues that were ongoing that eventually fizzled out, and there was reconciliation, and but you don't you don't stand in the pulpit and grandstand and go, this week I put out 4 or 5 fires that would have split the church wide open. You don't talk about that stuff.
Right.
And they they see your success, they see your failures a lot clearer sometimes than they understand the success.
That's right.
And you have to be called into it. It can't be something that you look at and say, oh, this is going to make me money, because there's way too many people that are quote unquote ministers that use the church for gain. I was watching on YouTube the other day of this minister. This happened a while ago, and he got up and chastised his congregation because they had not come together and bought him a particular type of watch, a very expensive watch. And I'm sitting there thinking,
Unbelievable.
I mean, if that is yes, we should honor the gifts among us again, but the gifts should not be demanding from the congregation.
Right.
And that's not what we're there for.
Right.
You don't see shepherds running down in the middle of the flock screaming at the sheep going, why aren't you producing more wool? That's not the image that Jesus portrayed as far as the pastor. And of course there's other offices that are in amongst the church, but a true minister, when the congregation rejoices, he or she is rejoicing, or they are rejoicing. When the congregation is hurt and wounded, they're crying among us and looking for healing.
Right.
To me, that's a true minister that has a congregation and has the heart for a congregation.
Right.
To me, what defines a pastor is not what we typically would see and what the famous pastors are good at. And that's reaching down and connecting to people on an emotional and spiritual level that inspires them to change their life in a way that's for the better.
Right.
It sounds grand and lofty, but that's as simple as holding someone's hand when their mother's dying.
Correct.
It's as simple as hearing people's deepest, darkest inner turmoil and holding that secret until the day you die.
Correct.
Right.
Oh yeah.
Right.
And that's not going on Oprah Winfrey's network and saying, oh my God, I'm the best thing since sliced bread, and all you have to do is these simple 3 things and you'll get to heaven. I don't know what else to say on that, because it sickens me that there are people perverting the office of pastor, priest, and bishop to the point to where they're literally making more than an NFL career holder.
Yeah. And I have no problem with a minister receiving a salary and stuff like that, but when you get to the place to where your salary is outweighing what your church is doing towards the homeless and things of that nature,
Correct.
then we've got an issue.
That's right.
If you have a mansion that is the size of a football field,
Yeah, that's a lot.
what can that money be used for to better serve the community and to serve the people? When I think of pastors and role models, I think of people like Paul and Timothy and Peter, who literally went out and asked the world, what can I do?
Right.
Yeah.
They went out into Asia Minor and planted something from nothing
Right.
and changed people to the point where in a couple hundred years it toppled an empire that was tyrannical.
Right. Yeah.
I mean,
to go back to something you touched on, how many ministers have we sat amongst? And I think ministers that can confide in each other to draw wisdom is a wise way in which to function. But how many times have we heard ministers going out in their congregation or little select groups betraying confidence of these people that, you know, you won't believe what this person just told me, and like, oh my God, how do I, you know, I have a select group of people that I'll confide in if I don't if I'm not 100% sure that I'm thinking clearly on a path of healing for this person. There's a huge difference. Or a group of ministers getting together and speaking such vile about their congregation. And, you know, some congregations do beat up their preachers so heavily that it leaves such a bitter taste in that minister's heart.
Yeah, don't join pastors' groups on Facebook. I
Yeah.
learned that the hard way.
It's a lot. But, you know, we had a minister at our church that, we actually had a couple at our church, and they would come out of counseling sessions or sit down sessions or go around and spreading stuff about the people amongst the congregation. And to me, that is it's such a betrayal of who you're supposed to be and of that person. And we wonder why sometimes folks do not want to come and confide in us.
And just the amount of carnage I've watched pastors do to their congregations is ridiculous.
Right.
And there is a flip side to that. I've also watched congregations just chew up.
Exactly.
Pure.
But I've just incident that comes to mind is a person was having an affair on their husband with somebody in the congregation, and instead of dealing with it in a diplomatic way, the pastor called a council of congregants within the church on how to deal with the problem. The quote-unquote problem.
Yeah.
Instead of just saying, I'm sorry that happened to you, let's not do that again.
Yeah.
And finding a clear way forward.
Yeah.
Instead, they declared Pastor whoever's ecumenical council.
Yeah.
Right.
And ended up kicking the woman out and alienating her from her family because of it.
When there was I'm not going to name names, but when I was younger, there was a prominent church that was part of a prominent, I guess they were kind of a mixture of Pentecostal and holiness back in the day. And it was a network of churches across the United States. But anyway, the local pastor of this local church was a psychologist by trade, and got all of his clients from his congregation.
Oh my.
And unfortunately, throughout time, began using the information he learned in sessions with them to basically subjugate them in the church.
Wow.
And it eventually blew the church completely apart.
Can't imagine why.
And a dear friend of mine was a member of this church right up to the end. And the amount of spiritual damage left behind was appalling. There were people that will never step foot in another church now from the damage caused by this one pastor. And that's why I tell all of our candidates for clergy, new clergy who come to me for advice and stuff, I tell them, I say, you know, one of the biggest things that you have to watch out for is to never do any harm.
Yeah.
Just like the Hippocratic Oath that doctors take. Do no harm. That's the first and primary law of a physician. Well, a physician heals the body, but the clergy are supposed to heal the spirit. You know, doctor, one time at the ER when I was a chaplain, he was one of these that didn't think chaplains had a point or purpose in the hospital, and he said to me, "Well, if I screw up, this person's going to die." And without missing a beat, I looked at him and said, "If I screw up, this person goes to hell for all eternity." He stood there and he looked at me for a minute and turned and walked off.
Yeah.
You know, but the reality is that's very much what we, as pastors, as clergy, live with, is that great responsibility, and so many people don't understand that. They don't understand that that's our responsibility. And something I want to touch on too, real quick, is this idea, and I hear it all the time from people. Well, you're a pastor. You only work one day a week.
Shit.
I'm sorry, no. You only see me work one day a week. When you come to church on Sunday, if you manage to come to church on Sunday, you see me one day a week working. We as clergy work 7 days a week, many of us do. Because our job never ends. It doesn't take a break. You know, it is not like if somebody calls me and says, my loved one's in the hospital dying, that we can say, well, it's 10:30 at night. I'll be there tomorrow morning at 8 o'clock when I'm back on shift. Well, there are some clergy that do that. But, you know, the reality is that's not what we're called to do. We can't just do that. We have to get up at 10:30 at night and go to the hospital to be there with their loved one. But, you know, so many people think that we work one day a week or we work banker's hours, and we don't.
Yeah.
And especially when you're bivocational. You know, Father Matt and Reverend Mark here, I'm going to embarrass them a slight bit here. They're bivocational, which means that they work a full-time job in the secular world, and then are pastors, not just, you know, say 5 p.m. to 10 p.m. on Monday through Friday, but they're even pastors while they're working. Because, like I said, things do not turn off in the world just because you're busy as a pastor.
My friends one day, it's funny that you mentioned it, they asked me, when do you get a break from pastoring? I'm like, never. And
Yeah.
they're like, what do you mean? And I said, and as I was sitting there explaining this to them, in the middle of a restaurant, no caller, no nothing, someone walks up to me and they just go, pardon me, sir, you just look like someone I can talk to. Can I talk to you for a minute? And proceeds to pull up a chair and just starts spilling all this crap
Yeah.
about what's going on with them and just seeking advice. And they stare at me wide-eyed and I say, that's why I don't get a day off.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm often at work. You know, I work 7:30 to 4, Monday through Friday. And any of my meetings for church are generally, because I do work close to the church, thankfully. So most of my meetings that I have to have usually take place at 4:30 or later. But because of my position, a lot of times I'll get instant messages, texts, and I'm very careful not to mix my pastoral duties at the same time of my work duties. I try to be very respectful of both. So what that means is depending on what the issue is, sometimes I can wait till I'm getting off at 4 to respond. Sometimes I can respond on my lunch break. So a lot of times I'm responding to emails and to text messages while I'm on lunch break. And if it's somebody in the hospital and it's a situation, sometimes, because again, my day job, the office is close to the hospital, I can, on my lunch break, jump off, run it over to the hospital, pray or whatever. Many times I've done funerals, and y'all know a lot of funerals are in the middle of the day, late morning. So I have to get off work, then I come back to work, and the way my work is, I have to make up that time. So I'm either staying late a few days, cutting my lunch break in half, and making up that time, or there for a while, especially when I first started as the full-time pastor at our church, I was having to bleed a lot of my personal time off.
That's right.
And that's the stuff, nobody sees. I don't stand up and talk about it, because I understand that when I accept the position, that it does come with sacrifice.
Yes, it does.
And a lot of people don't understand sacrificing things or bringing things to inconvenience. And Fridays are generally, when I get off, are days that I keep away, where I just do solely stuff for me, stuff with me and my boyfriend and my friends. Saturdays are generally a little bit of time doing all the stuff around the house that you don't do during the week. Like this week, I had 3 after-church meetings. I had a function for the church. And sometimes there'll be seasons in the church. It could be a month. Earlier this year, it was like 2 or 3 months, where almost every weekday, I was getting home at 8:30, 9 o'clock. And that was every night. And then I still had to do pastoral duties of sending stuff to our administrator, preparing for services, studying for Bible studies if we were having those, developing leadership in people. And so that's a lot of stuff that people don't see. They don't see the preparation.
That's right.
And y'all know, for some sermons, we may preach for 15, 20 minutes, 25 minutes. But your preparation time for that particular sermon could move into 3 or 4 hours.
That's right.
For me, a lot of times the sermons in my series and the things that I'm going to be discussing are on my heart the whole week.
That's right.
And so it's all those little, if you are pastoring correctly, then you're correct. You don't have a lot of time to just do whatever you want to. And there are seasons that I do pull away from rest. That was my downfall in my first pastorate, is I never rested. I never took time to pull away and to take breathers and to take care of myself. And that was a huge detriment. I become ineffective. I was always tired. And, people are always pulling from you, and
Stop calling me out like that.
and you have to do it, because if you don't, you become ineffective, and you speak from a place of weakness,
Right.
and tired and restlessness, as opposed from a place of renewed strength, focus, and vision. And that's generally when we start losing our peace, is because we become unfocused.
That's right.
And we move into that putting out fires instead of staying focused on the vision of the church and what we're supposed to do.
That's right.
When I was in seminary, the professors there said, find who your pastoral role model is. And I thought that was a physical, living being at that time. But as time has evolved, I found that I'm looking and reading at certain pastors and how they led, examples like Maximilian Kolbe, who became known as the pastor of Auschwitz. Literally, that's one of his nicknames, because even though he was in that difficult circumstance and situation, he was still ministering effectively to people up until the very end. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
did I say something?
No. I was looking at the rain.
Oh, okay.
We kind of held off the podcast for a little bit to try to get past the storms, and we didn't succeed. So it was.
Well, and
Here I
kinda
am
funny.
saying this poignant thing.
Yes, I know. My attention drifted.
well, and there are a lot of different functions of different ministers. I know we're
Sure.
kind of heavily on the pastoral part because that's pretty much where we are in. Of course, Bishop is in their position, and it's a little slightly different than just the regular old pastor like me.
The pastor of the pastors.
Pastor of the
here.
pastors. And so, but in the other offices and the other functions in the church, you still have that thread that is the same, where
Sure.
the desire is to see the church body fulfill their calls and their assignments.
Right.
And there's a little bit of a different approach based on those offices, but that's still got to be the heart. I remember being around a group of quote unquote evangelists and traveling ministers and stuff, and their saying used to be, live long, don't pastor. And
Right.
or I would pastor a church if there weren't any people in it, type of a mentality. And and the thought of pastoring scared the mess out of me for the longest, because that means you do have to be vulnerable and you have to be responsible to the growth of not only the church but to yourself. And
Right.
but when I entered into that position, and that's what I was supposed to do, there was such a joy that came over me. And yeah, there's times that it's so difficult, when you have people that will emotionally disconnect from you and you can't reach them. When you have people that are in those situations in life that, you're there to spiritually guide them, but it's beyond your ability. They're dealing with end of life situations. I mean, your heart breaks for those individuals, and you have to remind yourself of your assignment. You have to remind yourself of the call. And your assignments change based on your seasons. They're when I was when I was an interim pastor at MCC here in Augusta for a period of few months after one of our pastors left and before the other one came, my assignment was to stabilize the church.
Sure.
So I did everything. My focus was focusing on the small victories, focusing on the different areas that solidified growth and what we had, and bringing health and healing. And the church kind of stabilized after that rocky transition. Then when I moved into that when I became the permanent pastor, that was also the situation where I was focused on bringing that stability. So that season of stability for the longest period of time, and then the assignment kind of evolved into a place of, when the church is in growth mode, you're looking to make sure that everything is functioning with clarity, that vision is clear, that you're bringing forth those words and those messages that are in need of the congregation. So sometimes your assignments change, but your calling and your purpose remain. But at the heart of it, it is, how do we position people, both as a whole and individual? How do we position people to fulfill everything that God has for us,
Right.
and living that life that portrays to the world we have some answers, we've got peace, there's some joy amongst us. Even though we're imperfect, we serve an Almighty who is perfect.
And so let me, while we're here, and Reverend Mark kind of pointed that out, was I am in a little different role, but it's essentially like being a bishop or an overseer, an elder, whatever you want to call them. It's like being a pastor of just a bigger church.
Yeah.
It's because, as Father Matt said, I am the pastor to the pastors. So, pastors that are under my care, like Father Matt and Bishop Ben and Bishop Jim and Father Kevin and Father Jeff, and all of these come to me for spiritual guidance and for spiritual advice on their situations going on in their parishes or in their dioceses or whatever. And I also have to put out fires on a bigger level. So, if a fire at a particular parish gets beyond what the pastor can deal with, then it's my job to go and kind of fix that problem and make sure that that parish can continue to function and can stabilize beyond what they're at. And so it ends up being a much larger situation for me, and I've had my share of those in my time as a bishop, where I've had major fires that I have to put out, and where I have to deal with a clergy person who's kind of gone off the reservation or is not acting like a pastor should, and we've had to go through a remediation process or even a point of removing them from ministry, and so it's in a little bit of a larger scenario, but it's the exact same situation. I just have to be focused on a little bit of a larger scale and a little bit more movable parts, but it's still being a pastor. And I think a lot of people in my position as bishop forget that. They forget that they really are just a pastor, and they lose that pastor's heart and become more of just an administrator, and that's why you end up with some of the issues and scandals and problems you do coming from bishops, is that they forget that they're a pastor first.
And I think it's important, a lot of times people don't get the fact that ministers do, particularly pastors, they do have to deal with a large amount of legalities and administrative stuff. But it's important not to get so lost in that while it's, you may be overseeing the church, developing leaders under you that can be delegated to, not because you just don't want to handle something, but because your call and your goal and your desire is to focus on that big vision, that bigger picture of the church.
Right.
And there's a lot of things you don't learn in seminary. There's a lot of things you don't learn in preacher school for the lay person, that you end up learning down the road, but not to. And I think if you have good leadership under you and around you, to constantly be asking what is your perspective? How do you see the church? Because if you think you know it all, guess what? You're going to start losing it. You've just moved into a micromanaging position. If you're threatened by other ministers or other people that have gifts in the church, your church is going to dwindle, and then you're going to wear yourself out.
That's right.
I have people that are in various areas that are far more educated than me, and they're sitting in the pulpit, and I'm having to pastor and to be with them.
That's right.
And it can be very intimidating but you can't lose focus of who you are
Right.
and the direction that you're going.
Right.
If you do, again, you become a detriment to the church, and by detriment, you're stunting the growth, because if you're called to lead the church, then you've got to lead it, and it's only going to grow as far as your vision is.
Right.
And so that's why it's so important to reflect inward, ask Holy Spirit on a regular basis, direct me, let me see anything that I'm missing, communicating with your leaders, especially those that you trust that are in the church. Say, hey, how do you feel the church is going? I do this with my board on a regular basis and say, how do y'all feel the church is? What do you feel the temperature, the pulse of the church is? Is there anything you're seeing that I may not be seeing?
Right.
And that's a vulnerable state, because a lot of ministers think that they see all, hear all, and know all, and that's that's not a good, healthy way to lead and to pastor.
It's not.
Because you're going to miss stuff.
Yep.
There's going to be things that you don't see, and it should be one of the focuses. Let me back up. If you're focusing on bringing people into their purpose and their callings, this other stuff will kind of start taking care of itself, because people will start owning being
right.
leaders, stepping up to the plate, and so forth. Some people need a little encouragement to do it, and that's okay. My dad taught me years ago, you got to walk your spaces. You got to be familiar with what's going on in your churches or
That's
your
right.
businesses. Or
That's right.
he was not a pastor, but my dad has been in multiple leadership positions, and it's one thing he taught me early was, don't be so disconnected. Walk your spaces. Walk around with the janitor periodically and help
That's
them
right.
scrub the toilets so you can understand what's going on.
Amen.
And stuff like that. Be involved in the various areas in your church to some degree. Sit in on some meetings.
Right.
Take temperatures with people. And so a true minister will have a desire to see each person, each area flourish. And if they're overlooked or if a church succeeds, they all succeed.
Right.
If a church is failing, a lot of times it's because the pastor loses the understanding of the needs and the direction that church needs to be moving in.
Right. Bishop Jim has a wonderful saying that he tells candidates, and he says, if you're not willing to clean the toilet, you're not willing to be a pastor.
Yeah.
Sometimes, it's not all about standing in the pulpit. It's not even about sitting in the office with somebody who's, just lost a loved one or experienced a divorce. Sometimes it's something as simple as sweeping the floor or cleaning the toilet, And so if you're not
Exactly.
willing to do that kind of job and that kind of work, then you're really not willing to be a pastor.
Right.
At all. And so we have to always remind people, especially candidates in going into clergy, that part of our job is that mundane.
Yep.
It is the mundane things. It's not all glamorous, and it's not all about look at me. It's the little things that we do that nobody ever sees.
That's exactly right.
So I think that it's important to remember, too, as we wrap up here, that clergy are humans.
Yes.
We are no better than anybody else. We're striving towards the same goal you're striving towards, struggling with the same things you're struggling with. 75% of clergy about 15 years ago in a Pew research poll, 75% of clergy suffer from some sort of mental health struggle, depression, anxiety, things of that nature. that is probably much higher now
Oh yeah.
since COVID, as COVID has really hurt the church. And so there are probably clergy that are, probably far more clergy that are struggling with depression and anxiety today than ever before. So remember that too when you're talking with your pastor. Take a moment to thank your pastor, to thank those that are in leadership in your churches and your faith communities, because it's not an easy job. It is definitely a difficult job. Any final thoughts, Reverend Mark?
Yeah, I mean, you know, if you have a congregation of 30, 75, 1,000, you've got 30, 75, 1,000 opinions on how a church should function.
Right.
And it's just as much the responsibility of the congregation to be filled with grace and mercy towards their leaders as it is their leaders to be filled with grace and mercy towards their congregation.
Sure.
And, one of my bishops that I studied and was under when I was a young minister, there was a few things that he would always encourage me to do. He said, as a pastor, there's a few things you need to know. And I was waiting for these great big, awe-inspiring things. And he said, make sure you have a plunger for the toilets, jumper cables in your car, and be sure that you are focused on being filled with that grace and the mercy towards your people. And never lose sight of that, even when it gets crazy sometimes.
That's right.
Know that God will always come up under you to give you that strength to get through any situation. And it's the truth, especially the plunger and the jumper cable part.
That's right. Great advice right there. All right. Thank you, Reverend Mark and Father Matt, for being here tonight. Father Matt had to run off for a moment, but we appreciate you guys joining us tonight for the podcast, and all of our audience as well. Just a reminder that you can join us on TikTok or on YouNow for our studio audience if you'd like to ask questions or be a part of the live recording on Saturday evenings around 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Don't have a topic yet for next week, but we'll have one before next week. Until then, keep shining bright, my friends.